Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Horror Movie Syllabus. My name is Professor Victor, and I'll be your host as we go through all of the essential, noteworthy, interesting, and notorious modern horror films. If you're new to the channel, I recommend you check out the introduction video. There's a link to it in the description below, and it'll give you a pretty good overview of what we usually do here at the Horror Movie Syllabus, which is look at a particular subgenre of horror, and then we pick 3 movies from that subgenre to explore. And right now we're working our way through the Horror Movie Supplement, which was an additional 100 subgenres to the original 100 subgenres in the Horror Movie Syllabus, with a little bit more of a niche and weird and interesting and fun, fun in quotes, different subgenres to go through. And today the subgenre we're looking at is snuff movies, or more specifically, horror movies about snuff movies, because we're not watching any actual snuff movies on this video. And if you were expecting that, sorry, YouTube guidelines. But the focus of this video are horror movies about snuff films. So movies where the plot of the movie is focused on like a ring, a snuff ring, or a snuff film, and investigating the snuff industry, stuff like that. And that's the kind of movies that we're talking about today. So we're not really talking about movies that purport to be a snuff film or things like that. Things like August Underground, something like that. We've already talked about that, by the way. And we don't really repeat movies here on the Horror Movie Syllabus. If you're new, we don't do repeats. So if we have talked about it already, we're not talking about it here. So you're not going to see like Sinister or even Videodrome or even the movie Snuff, because we've covered all of those already before under other subgenres. So we're not revisiting them here. That's okay, because we have plenty to talk about. We have plenty of movies that deal with this snuff taboo, this snuff urban legend, if you will. The idea, the urban legend that snuff films actually existed, which I think is more mysterious or has more mystique built around it in the past, like in the 90s or even earlier, than it does now, where everybody has a camera in their pocket and making videos, and where you just kind of assume that snuff films would exist because how could they not at this point? But this is really a focus on a focus on films that are focused on snuff films. And these are interesting movies. They're an interesting take because, like I said, they're dealing with this taboo subject matter, but they're trying to be a step removed from it and kind of like brush up against the real sordidness and griminess, if you will, of a snuff film without actually trying to be a snuff film, with maybe an occasional different exception here and there. We'll get into that as we go on in the video, but for the most part, it's like a step removed. It's like a voyeur looking in, and that in and of itself lends itself to more of an interesting psychological exploration of the appeal of a snuff film. And a lot of these movies are focused on that, and I find that to be particularly fascinating. Watching a movie about somebody ripping somebody up is perfectly fine. Like, hey, I love me some slasher movies, So the idea of a snuff film, the idea that it's really happening instead of like Jason doing it, is not really a problem. But there's an interesting sublayer in the fact that the idea of a real snuff film in real life with real people watching it is fascinating. It's a fascinating thing. Like, what drives somebody to want to see that? What drives somebody to not be able to look away from it, even if they don't want to see it? And that's what I think a lot of these movies dig into, is that compulsion, that allure of the snuff film. And that's something that I find really interesting. And these movies are really, really interesting. We're going to talk about 3 movies that I think definitely merit some discussion and we haven't talked about before. And we're going to look at them in increasing order of notoriety. So as we go on, the movies are going to get more and more notorious. And, that'll be the undergraduate, graduate, and postgraduate levels as we go on. But honestly, these are all just really great movies. But the subject matter is a little seedy, man. It's a little bit uncomfortable, and some people might not be down with it. I assure you that most of these movies are not really going to be too difficult to stomach, but there might be 1 or 2 that are a bit of an issue. But buckle up. It won't be that bad of a ride, but it'll definitely be a fascinating one. So sit back, relax, and let's check out these snuff movies. Movies about snuff movies. You understand. The first movie that we're looking at today, the undergraduate level selection, is Vacancy. Vacancy came out in 2007, and it's an interesting one to lead off with because it's not necessarily the most beloved or even the most well-known movie that we'll be talking about, but it's interesting in what it does do, and more importantly, what it doesn't do, especially given the era that it comes out and all the competing movies that it's competing with, and the way it chose to tell its story, given the subject matter, is noteworthy for a couple of different reasons. But we're going to get into all of that as we discuss the movie. First, if you haven't seen it before, the movie is about a married couple that's having some problems that are on a trip, Luke Wilson and Kate Beckinsale, and their car breaks down. And they're going to have to wait till the morning to get it fixed. And so they have to stay at this kind of seedy, strange motel run by this seedy, strange guy who's a little off putting. And when they get in their room, they discover a series of snuff films that have been made, filmed in that hotel room. And they realize they're in danger. They are not necessarily going to be able to make it through the night unscathed. And so we'll go ahead and just stop there so as not spoil the movie any farther. But the movie is an interesting and fun setup, a rather simple setup that works for me really, really well. I like this notion of just, you're going to stay at a strange motel. It's an unexpected plan. You're trapped there because your car doesn't work and hijinks abound. That's cool for me. I'm already in on that from like a slasher film mentality. But this movie does something slightly different. That is, it introduces this snuff angle and by extension, a snuff ring angle. Somebody is making these snuff films, killing patrons of the hotel, the motel, and making these films for a reason. And that makes it an interesting, not so much mystery as more like a thriller type thing. And one of the things I like about this movie is that it is a really solid thriller. I like to call it like Hitchcock light. It's not as good as like a Hitchcock movie, but it's got that Hitchcock sensibility. And this is what makes it noteworthy because this movie is coming out in a time period where it's like, Saw, post Saw, and everything is kind of leaning towards the torture porn subgenre, right? Everything is going into like really showing the torment and the physical torture and the gruesome details and the gore and the violence and everything. And this movie is primed for that. It's totally set up for just delivering that kind of torture porn aesthetic, the things like Captivity or Hostel or something like that. This movie, it's snuff films, right? So it's definitely set up to be this kind of movie, and then it doesn't do that. It shows you snippets of the snuff films that Luke Wilson and Kate Beckinsale find, but just snippets, just enough for you to get a really clear idea of how awful they are. But most of what is shown is just like going to give you enough to fuel your imagination to what you're not being shown. Unlike the other torture porn movies of the decade of that time period, this movie holds back. It kind of goes with the less is more approach. It doesn't show the gruesomeness and instead kind of was coy about it and let your imagination fill in the blanks. And I'll be honest with you, the first time I saw this movie, which is when it came out, I was a little disappointed by that. I was expecting something a little bit more gruesome. I was expecting something to be a little, torture porny because that was kind of what we were getting. And I'm down for that. I like violence in my movies. You know that. So I was kind of put up with that. And so I was like a little lukewarm. I mean, it still was a good movie to me, but it was a little lukewarm the first time I saw it. But when I revisited it, understanding what I was going to get, I could appreciate it a lot more. I could appreciate the nerve of them to go and buck the trend and try to do something different. But more importantly, to try to give this Hitchcockian flavor to the movie, this kind of suspense thing. The idea of the famous thing where Hitchcock talks about, if a bomb goes off, it's a surprise in the movie. But if you tell somebody that a bomb's under the table and they know they've got 5 minutes till it goes off, it builds up all this tension. It had a similar idea here. They tell you pretty upfront, snuff films. Snuff films being made in this hotel room, and they are in the room, so they are the next victims. And so you are just waiting for that shoe to drop. And then they do a good job of just ratcheting that tension up, ratcheting it up, ratcheting it up. It works really, really well. They manage to sustain that suspense throughout the movie, actually, and it, like a Hitchcock movie. And again, the Hitchcock comparison may be a little bit of a reach, a little bit ambitious, but I do really think that as a thriller, as a suspense movie, it works extremely well. But if you're going here looking for the gore, you're going to be disappointed. But I think that's okay. I think it's good to do this. I think again, it bucked the trend, and I think it winds up being better because, like, I don't know about you, but my imagination when it comes to these things can get pretty crazy. So, letting me wonder what's going on, just showing me their reactions while they're watching the snuff films rather than the actual snuff films is pretty effective. And it's actually a kind of a trope that gets used in a lot of movies like this, where you don't actually see what they're looking at; you just see their expressions and how horrifying it is in the look on their faces, and it's pretty effective. They use it rather well here, and it allows them to keep that tension ratcheted. Now, if there is a hiccup on this, It's that the ending is a little bit abrupt. It kind of just like ends a little bit, and I don't think it's necessarily an unsatisfying ending. I don't want to spoil it, so I'm kind of dancing around this a little bit, but it ends a little more pat than you would expect it to, given everything you've been seeing and given what you know what the movie's about. It's a little bit of a pat ending, and I imagine that's a little bit of why it's not a beloved movie. People don't really seem to love this movie. This is not one that people talk about a lot. It was apparently liked enough to get a sequel that I think was straight to video. I don't know, but Vacancy 2, the first cut, it's actually a prequel technically. And it's a forgettable movie, as evidenced by the fact that I have seen this movie and I remember pretty much nothing about it except that it doesn't really add anything to anything. And it's basically unrelated essentially, and so you don't care about it. It's definitely not a must see. But I would say that the original one is, if not a must see, it's definitely a good watch. I really enjoy this movie. I do think it's an underrated movie. I think that the strength of the two leads is a big part of why they got two good actors. Kate Beckinsale, a really good actor, to be in this movie and anchor the drama of it. You know, you've got this bickering couple that now have to work together to survive, and how does that change their relationship? And it's the same kind of thing you have in The Strangers, but I feel like it's actually working a little bit better. The personal drama aspect of it works better in this movie than it does in The Strangers. I think The Strangers are the better movie, frankly, but it's very similar concepts of both movies. And I feel like if you like one, you're probably going to like the other also. So if you like The Strangers, check this movie out. If you like Kate Beckinsale or Luke Wilson, check this movie out. If you like movies about snuff films, check this movie out. There's a lot of reasons to like this movie and check it out. And I really, again, I don't think there's a lot of reason to hate this movie unless you're really looking for something extra violent. You're not going to get that here. So if you've seen it, let me know if you agree. Let me know if you think that this movie is an underrated thriller or if you found it to be disappointing and forgettable, because that does seem to be the prevailing opinion, and I seem to be bucking that trend. But and if you haven't seen it, you've heard my recommendation. Check it out and let me know what you think. The next movie that we're looking at, the graduate level selection, is 8 Millimeter. 8 Millimeter came out in 1999 and was directed by Joel Schumacher, who is the visionary director who gave us Batman Forever and Batman and Robin, and I'm still mad about it. I'm still upset about that because the movie are terrible. But he also gave us The Lost Boys, and he will forever get a pass just for that because it's one of the greatest vampire movies of all time. We talked about that. But directed by Joel Schumacher, written by Andrew Kiffin Walker of Seven fame, and we're going to get into that a little bit more in just a second. But if you haven't seen 8 Millimeter before, the movie stars Nicolas Cage as a private investigator hired by an old woman who's very wealthy. Her wealthy husband has passed away, and in cleaning out his safe and his affairs, they have found a film of a woman being killed, a snuff film, and she's hiring Nicolas Cage to do an investigation and determine if the film is real. And as he digs into this case and goes down this rabbit hole, he finds himself mired in the very sordid underbelly of snuff filmmaking and alternative sex stuff and just really creepy things. And hijinks abound, as I'm sure you can imagine they would. But this movie is one that's going to always come up if you're talking about movies about snuff films. This is like the quintessential movie. This is one that seems to be very well known because of its subject matter. And honestly, I think the subject matter, knowing about the subject matter, kind of overshadowed the quality of the film. The movie never seems to quite get its due. In fact, it was hated by the critics when it came out, which is unfortunate because I think it's an underrated gem for sure. Now, you know me, I like me some Nicolas Cage when he's doing horror movies. And you get two different kinds of horror with Nicolas Cage. You get two different kinds of movies with Nicolas Cage. You get the ones where he's kind of going balls out crazy, Nick Cage, uncaged. And then you've got the ones where he's trying to give you a little bit more of a nuanced performance or a little bit more of something a little bit more grounded. And it's the latter that you get here. He's trying to do his Leaving Las Vegas style acting, and I think he's quite successful here. We were just talking in Vacancy, when we talked about Vacancy, about the whole reaction shot thing, the idea where you're just seeing somebody's face as they watch a snuff film. I believe that originates here. I think that Schumacher is the first person to actually do this, and it is very effective. Nick Cage really sells the horror and the anguish of watching a real snuff film of something awful. And again, like Vacancy, you're getting the barest glimpses of what he's seeing. You don't really get to see it. You hear it, which again, more effective. Your mind really kind of runs with it when you hear the stuff going on. And then you get, Nick Cage's face. It's really selling this to you. Nick Cage is bringing his A game here, and I think it's a big part of why I think this movie works really, really well. The rest of the cast is also really solid here. Not the least of which is Joaquin Phoenix, who plays like this sex shop worker or porn store worker who is helping Nick Cage with his investigation. And it's a young Joaquin Phoenix, and he's kind of an alt kind of guy and everything like that. And he's the gateway or the entry of Nicolas Cage into the seedy underbelly, this seedy world of sex and violence and stuff like that. And it's fun because he's like this positive and kind of upbeat and likable character introducing you to this really scummy world. And we are Nick Cage as we go into this movie. Most of us, I would imagine, kind of being introduced to this world, and it's nice to have the Joaquin Phoenix character, Max, I think his character's name is, kind of walking us through all this and kind of explaining it to us like we're seven because we don't really know this. And speaking of seven, Andrew Kevin Walker is the writer of this movie, and this is probably the biggest strength about this is that it is a very gritty, dark movie like Seven. It's very, very bleak, and it's got that feeling like you want to take a shower after you watch it, and like it's just incredibly bleak and sad and just overwhelmingly depressing, and it really works. But I do wonder if that's why the movie also doesn't get a lot of critical love, is because of how bleak it is, how dark it is, and how uncomfortable it makes you feel. Which Seven did the same thing, and Seven got critical love. So I don't know if that's really the case, but it does seem to be a hard movie to like for that reason. And although it is a hard movie to like, there are a lot of people like me who do like it. It does have a little bit of a following, and it has a reputation. Again, it's really well known as a movie about snuff films, one of the kind of quintessential ones. And it also was apparently good enough to have a sequel, although it's an in-name only sequel. So I guess it's got enough of a reputation that the name would have some value because the sequel is completely unrelated. And they just took the name and slapped it on there. It was titled something else, and they just retitled it 8mm too to get the cachet off the name. So I guess there was enough cachet to do that. I've never actually seen the sequel, but by all accounts, it's just not even worth watching. It's got nothing to do with the original, and you can just skip it. So I have. But the original one is not one that should be skipped, I don't think. I really do believe that it is underrated. And again, noteworthy, if for nothing else, for that reaction shot. If it really is the first origin of that kind of reacting to snuff shot, that's pretty noteworthy in and of itself. But again, Joel Schumacher doing good work here, not doing Batman and Robin work, doing Lost Boys type work here. Not as fun as Lost Boys, but very competent and moody and dark directing. Really, really solid. Andrew Kevin Walker's script is very, very good. It's dark. It goes some interesting places. And as you watch Nick Cage descend into this world and seeing how it taints him and how it affects him and how it breaks him down, that is interesting. That is, to me, the strength of this movie, is watching the effects of a snuff film on somebody. To watch how you have to watch it. You are forced to watch it. And then how it affects you, how you are never the same afterwards. And once you're into that world, what does it do to your world? What does it do to you psychologically? That's what this movie's about. It's not about the violence on the screen of the snuff film. It's not even about the violence that happens in the movie, because there is violence that happens in the movie. It's about the psychological like destruction of a human being. Fascinating stuff. Really dark, really cool, and definitely worth your time. If you haven't seen it before, I would definitely say check it out. And I'm guessing a lot of you have seen it. And I don't know if any of you would have the same, if you seen this as I do about this. I actually think this movie is excellent. I think it's great. But again, I know I'm in the minority on this, so give me your counter opinions in the comments by all means. But if you haven't seen it, you owe it so you're something to check it out at least once and see Cage doing quality work, Schumacher doing quality work, Walker's script doing really, being really solid, Joaquin Phoenix doing excellent work. Basically, just a really well made movie, taking a really interesting topic and taking a really interesting angle on that topic. Definitely check it out. And the next movie that we're talking about today, the postgraduate level selection, is Man Bites Dog. Man Bites Dog came out in 1992 and is definitely the most notorious of the movies that we're talking about here. And it is a Belgian movie in French made by a bunch of student filmmakers who decided to try to do basically a no-budget black and white self-made movie and try to see if they could come up with something that was really interesting and enduring. And well, frankly, they succeeded. They succeeded. So let's get into that. If you haven't seen it before, the premise of the movie is that a documentary film crew is following around a serial killer while he commits his crimes and documenting his crimes and letting him explain his world to them. And as they go on deeper and deeper and get involved into his life, they become more and more complicit and more comfortable and more culpable in his crimes, and eventually starting to get involved in the crimes themselves, capturing all of it on camera in basically a voyeuristic snuff film. But we're going to go ahead and stop there so as to not spoil it any further for anybody. But this movie is a trip primarily because of this premise, which is a very cool premise, admittedly. The idea of essentially a mockumentary following a killer around and seeing how he does his work, what he does, what makes him tick, and his thought process and everything like that is a really neat idea that gets copied later on. I mean, Rise of Leslie Vernon is Behind the Mask is the same thing, except it's done a little bit less realistically and a little bit more for fun. And we've talked about that movie before, so we don't need to get into it. But this one seems to be somewhat of a pioneer in that very niche area, and it's a very clever way to address your limitations, both in terms of budget and in terms of skill, like filmmaking skill. It's like you've got a documentary film crew, but they're not necessarily super polished and they don't have any money. That would make some sense, and given the circumstances of what they're filming, the camera work may not be perfect and stuff like that. And filming it in black and white, probably makes it less gory and less, easier to get past censors and stuff like that. But it also gives it a very documentary feel. It gives it a very like cinema verite, like, I mean not cinema verite, but a real, like, very realistic, like almost slice of life, like very honest and authentic and a newsworthy style of feel to the footage, which is very, very effective. And then the premise is further compounded and enhanced by the idea that the way that the film crew gets complicit in the violence being committed is kind of this allegory, because it's like they start out by watching, and then as time goes on they get more and more drawn into this world, and by extension we are watching it as well. And how complicit are we in watching this and kind of contributing to it as well? And there's a commentary about that is fascinating. It's really cool stuff, very ambitious stuff for student filmmakers to be trying to do. But the problem is that they are students, you're trying to be filmmakers, and one of their problems is a lack of budget, and more specifically, a lack of a budget to film actual actors. They are playing the roles themselves, and the issue with that is the acting is oftentimes rather poor. And one of the biggest ones is the most egregious one is the guy playing the serial killer, because he, I don't know, like some people might be really into the performance. I'm not. He's not really selling me. Like, I don't know, like, I don't think you have to act a certain way. Like, he doesn't have to be extra creepy or something like that. And he's trying to play it off like he's very gregarious and likable and everything like that. And that's an interesting take on it. Like, he's charming and like making people like him and stuff like that. And so then he's like, the violent tendencies he has seem like they kind of come out of nowhere, stuff like that. And that seems, when I say it, it sounds great. The problem is that I find him to be very unlikable. I don't find him to be charming. And I think it's more the performance and less the way the character's written. I mean, you're not supposed to like him because he's a villain, right? But I think you're supposed to kind of like him. You're supposed to be charmed by him, and I don't find him charming. I find him to be kind of annoying and a little bit fake and a little bit gross, and he doesn't really sell me on that charm. He's not pulling off a Ted Bundy. You know what I mean? He's awkward and I don't know. It just, he doesn't sit well with me. I didn't like the performance. And they even use his real family members as his family members in the movie. That stuff actually worked for me. Those interactions I thought were really, really good because they're authentic, frankly. The family didn't quite understand what the movie was about. And so you get some really authentic performances out of them. But the killer, I find him hard to watch, and it's just him the entire time. So that is a challenge for me in watching this movie. And then some of the murders are staged in a way that are, the actors aren't good. They're not pulling off. They don't actually look afraid. They don't actually look like they're actually being killed or attacked or whatever. And it takes me right out of it. It just doesn't look very real. Now, some people will say that's because this is actually a black comedy. Like, you see it when you look this up, or when you look up reviews of it, or people talking about it, they describe it as a black comedy. Like, oh, it's trying to be funny and this and that. I don't think it is. I don't really agree with that. I don't really buy. I think that's a retrospective way to try to excuse the flaws of this movie. Like, oh, the violence is so over the top, and you can't take it seriously because like, look at how silly it is. Except that there are some scenes in here that are very effective and are taken seriously and are realistic. So I don't believe that it's a black comedy, or that it was intended to be a black comedy. It might be a black comedy by default because they kind of failed a little bit in what they were trying to accomplish. But I don't think that's the case. I don't think it's intended to be a black. It's not like Tommy Wiseau with The Room. Like, oh, I meant it to be like this. No, no, I don't buy it because of the gang rape scene. Frankly, the gang rape scene, which is the scene that is, the one that got it banned in certain places, this and that. Like, this movie has a reputation for being like a really violent and gruesome movie to watch, and for the most part, I think that reputation is overrated. I don't think this movie is nearly as rough of a watch as people say it is. Like, by today's standards and what we see in modern movies, this movie back in 1992 when it came out, and I did not see it when it came out. I saw it years later. When it came out, it was probably pretty shocking, but by today's standards, it really isn't. By a lot of the movies we've seen, we've talked about here on the channel, not that shocking. So this movie, the reputation is overblown in my opinion, except the rape scene is pretty rough. That one is pretty, but even then, the acting in that is a little bit suspect. It's a little, there's a, I don't want to get into it too much, but the victim, one of the victims is just looking a little too passive, and I don't know. But it's such an upsetting scene because of the whole totality of what's going on, and the concept of this whole thing about being complicit and stuff like that. It's really rough. That's where the reputation is earned, and that's what makes me think they weren't trying to make a comedy. I don't buy it. And it may be obvious from my tone that I don't love this movie. I'm not a huge fan of this movie. Like, it's not bad. I'm not offended by it. I think that given the limitations of their budget and their resources, it's really well made. I do wish they had gotten real actors or just a couple of better actors and really tried to sell some of the violence a little bit more, because even though it's been exceeded by the stuff we see today, like August Underground, which, stuff like that, this movie would still be very effective if I bought into the murders more, if I bought into the gruesomeness of the violence a little bit more. If it felt more realistic, I would really buy into this whole concept of the viewer, me, being more complicit in this as well. But when it seems fake, it doesn't really hit the same way, for me at least. Now, I might be in the minority of this. I know, again, this movie is very notorious. It's got a reputation of being pretty rough, and a lot of horror fans will really extol the virtues of this one, and that's great. It falls short for me, but I imagine if you can get past the acting and some of the other kind of slog parts of the movie that it drags a little bit, this could be a rather effective movie for you. It could be a really rough, violent, and intense movie. For me, it doesn't live up that reputation, except for that one scene. That one scene is pretty rough. Everything else, but actually, there's two scenes. There's another scene with a kid involved that's a little bit rough. Again, not a comedy, man. Like the kid scene, I don't think they're trying to be funny there. I really, really don't. And I think if you have a problem seeing kids getting killed and stuff like that, a little bit of an issue. So I don't want to undersell how gruesome this movie could be for you. But for the hardcore horror fans, I think you're going to find it to be overrated like I do. So that's kind of my weird mixed message recommendation of this movie. Like, I do think it's worth seeing for sure. I just don't love it. And I don't love it because I feel like it's a little overrated is my opinion on it. So if you've seen it, let me know if you agree with me. Is it overrated to you, or do you think it really does deserve the reputation it has? And if you haven't seen it, watch at your own risk. Like, you've heard what I've had to say about it. You get an idea what it's about. Watch at your own risk. Decide for yourself whether or not it's going to be something you want to check out, because it ain't for everybody. But for those of you it is for, let me hear about it in the comments below. So that's going to do it for our exploration into movies that are exploring snuff films. But I've got a few extra credit movies because of course I do. Of course I do. And there's some really good ones to check out here, underrated gems in my opinion. So let's dig into those. The first movie that I'm going to talk about is Mute Witness. Mute Witness came out in 1995 and is a movie that's set in Russia, but it's not a Russian film because it's got American leads and it's in English for the most part. And it also stars Alec Guinness. Alec Guinness is in there in one of his final roles, and that's kind of cool too. But if you haven't seen the movie before, it's about a mute woman who works as a special effects person on a movie that's being made by her sister's boyfriend in Russia, slasher film. And one night she goes back to set when it's closed and witnesses people filming what she thinks is a porn film, but turns out to be a snuff film. And the ensuing chase and stalking of her by the people who are in this snuff ring to try to silence her so that she can't rat them out and expose their snuff ring is the ensuing tension and mystery and suspense of the film. And we'll stop there so as to not spoil it for anybody who hasn't seen it. And I imagine there might be a lot of people, because it feels like this movie, which is very loved by the critics, gets very positive reviews, doesn't seem to be that well known or that popular. And I was surprised by this because when I was, getting everything together for making this video and doing the research on it, I was surprised to find out how like little love there seems to be for Mute Witness. I thought this movie was much more mainstream than it is. I knew it came out in the '90s and everything like that. And it's a little bit of the dearth of horror movies at the time, but I thought this movie was a bit more of a hit and a bit more well known and a bit more cult love for it than it actually is. It doesn't seem to be getting any of that, and that's a shame because it's a really well made, fun movie. Again, it's more about a suspense than it is about like violence and gore and stuff like that. It's kind of taking like the Vacancy approach to that, and to its benefit too. Like you do see like the snuff violence being filmed and stuff like that, but it's not really focused on that. It really is focused more on like this kind of, again, I'm going to say it again, Hitchcockian suspense thing about this woman who can't speak being pursued by people. And I'll be honest with you, the mute thing feels a little bit like a gimmick for the most part. There's not a huge narrative need for her to not be able to speak. It does have some certain scenes that are kind of fun where she literally can't scream for help and people don't realize she's in danger, or she can't make a phone call for help without the help of like a machine to speak for her. So there's some fun like tense moments because that are driven by the fact she can't talk. But narratively, it's not a real big issue that she's mute. It feels more like a gimmick to have those scenes. But thematically, it does make sense. Like she literally can't speak, and you've got people trying to silence her. And I think that's pretty cool. That's pretty fun. It also makes for a great title. Mute Witness is a great title. But it really is a cool allegory. I don't know, like a theme of being silenced and her trying to find her voice metaphorically because she can't literally is a cool idea, and it's just a fun well-made movie. It moves. It's got some bizarre notes of comedy in there that strangely work for me. They almost feel like shoehorned in. Like there's some weird stuff, like the director boyfriend is a little bit wacky, and towards the end it gets a little bit grating towards the end. I'm not gonna lie to you, it gets a little bit grating towards the end, but his comic relief strangely kind of works for me, and it shouldn't, because the rest of the movie is ultra serious and really kind of heavy, and it's dark but not too dark. It's like dark light, and it does have Alec Guinness in there, who apparently was doing a favor. He didn't even get paid to do this movie. He just did a couple scenes as a favor to be put into the movie, and it's just kind of a fun little Easter egg almost because he's just in a couple scenes, and I mean, it's Obi-Wan Kenobi in a movie about snuff films. What the hell, but I feel like this is like an underrated gem. I feel like this movie doesn't get enough love, so I definitely wanted to bring it up to you guys. And if you haven't seen it, check this one out. It deserves to be seen. And maybe some of you, I'm sure some of you, I know for a fact, at least one of you has seen this. Uncle Pete, I know you watched this recently. So, tell me in the comments below if you guys like this as much as I do. I think this movie's great. Underrated, for sure. So if you haven't seen it, definitely check it out. The next extra credit movie I'm going to mention is a movie called Thesis. Thesis came out in 1996, and it's a Spanish film directed by Alejandro Amenábar, who is the director of The Others and Abre los Ojos. We've talked about him a couple times, and this is his first feature film, and it is a really, really great debut. If you haven't seen it before, the movie is about a film student who is doing a thesis on violence in film, and she wants to explore more and more violent material, and she gets paired with a film student who really is into violent movies, but her advisor, her faculty advisor, winds up dying while watching a snuff film that she manages to get a hold of. And then she starts exploring the origins of the snuff film and what is it real, where did it come from, who's behind it, and really winds up uncovering a snuff ring at the school. And she finds herself to be in very big danger. And of course, hijinks abound, as they do. This movie is really, really underrated, really, really great. I was surprised, by how great of a debut this is. That doesn't seem like it gets a whole lot of love. I don't know. Like, I mean, Amenábar is not necessarily as famous as like a Del Toro or something like that, but he's got a name and he's made some really noteworthy movies that we've talked about before. And this one being his debut it's really a really good movie. And it really delves into that psychology of why do you like to watch violence? They're literally talking about this in the movie. Like that's her whole thesis, and why is she drawn to it? Why is she not able to take her eyes off of it? It's the crux of the movie. It's what really makes the whole movie's like dissertation on violence work for me. Again, once again, we're not focusing on the violence itself. You only get glimpses of the footage, and then you get the reaction shot, that we've talked about. And actually, come to think of it, this predates 8 millimeter. So even though people do tend to give Joel Schumacher credit for that, I do think this movie did it first. But it's again very effective. Watching this woman watch these movies and being both horrified and drawn to the movies, fascinating. Her film buff character, friend character, is fascinating. Probably reflects a lot of us who have, a love for, gory horror films and stuff like that. And, as she gets deeper and deeper into this world of pornography and violent movies and of ultimately snuff, and then all the people that are involved as she starts to uncover the ring, the story's mystery unravels, and the tension just ratchets up and up and up. But it really never loses focus on this question of why do we like this stuff? Why is there a market for this stuff? Why do people have it? Why is she compelled to look at it? What is her fascination both with death and with violence and with like taboo? Great stuff. And the performances are great. Anna Torrent is fantastic as the lead. Everybody in the movie is really, really good. The movie, arguably a little bit predictable. You kind of know where it's going to go. You kind of know who's going to turn up in this investigation. The very end did actually manage to surprise me a little bit. It didn't go exactly the way that I thought it was going to go, but it did for the most part kind of hit the beats I thought it was going to hit, but not in a way that I was unsatisfied. In fact, quite the contrary. I actually was very satisfied with this movie. I think this movie, again, underrated gem. Foreign film, so probably lesser known, but man, really, really good. Another one of these ones where they're focused more on the suspense and the mystery and the tension and the thriller aspect rather than the violence aspect to its benefit. And this is another one that I would definitely recommend you check out if you haven't seen it before. And I'm guessing much fewer of you have seen this one because it's just not as well known, and it's not the others, it's not Abre los Ojos, but it's definitely one that you should check out if you like Spanish films, if you like movies about snuff films, if you like Hitchcockian style thrillers. This is definitely a must see check out for you. So check it out and let me know what you think. And the last extra credit movie that we're going to talk about today is Last House on Dead End Street. Last House on Dead End Street came out in 1977. And from that title, you can tell that they're trying to bank on the popularity of Last House on the Left. In fact, this movie, I think it was originally titled The Fun House, or in some markets was still called The Fun House, and they just took this name to capitalize on the notoriety of Last House on the Left. And did it really work on doing it? Was it successful? No, not really. But this movie is still worth talking about for a number of reasons, which we're about to get into. First, if you haven't seen it before, the movie is about a convict who gets released from prison and decides to start up a snuff ring. Decides to start making snuff films as his way of like thumbing his nose at the society that locked him away. And he gets a crew of like-minded people on his side, filmmakers, to help him make snuff films, help him to kill people and record it and produce it, and basically kind of co-opt the porn industry, who's always looking for something more and more extreme as tastes get more and more extreme. And we'll stop there so as to not spoil the movie too much for you. But once again, we're getting that exploration into like the desire for more and more taboo, more and more violent, more and more gruesome stuff. This movie is also focusing on that. There's this remarkable conversation early on between porn producers where the one of the producer and a director, and he's asking the director for more stuff, and then the stuff he's getting is too tame, and he's like, oh, the people want more, we want more. And they've got this this idea that people, even normal people, want more extreme stuff. And so that's what gives birth to the desire for snuff. When this ex-con starts making snuff films, and they're interested in it, they're interested in what he's making and whether or not they can sell it. And that's an interesting angle in this movie, which is an interesting movie to be made because this movie is very low budget. It's made by a guy named Roger Watkins, who actually went on to have a career as a porn director, interestingly enough, considering the kind of underlying story of this movie. But what's interesting is everybody's like using an alias in the credits of this movie. And so one of the things that gives this movie its notoriety is that people thought it might be real because nobody knew who was in it, and they couldn't find these people. And they thought that maybe these people were really killed, which, is a great marketing scheme, but the way that they used the credits and kind of mask people's identities really fed into this. And that's pretty fun. But really what it is just a bunch of students that he got to participate in this movie that he was trying to make on the cheap because he had a very limited budget. like I think it was like $2,000 or something like that. And he actually only spent like $800 of it. In 1977 money, so it's about like $4,000 now. But he spent like the $800 to make the movie. Spent the rest of it getting high because he was basically high the entire time. And that kind of shows in this movie because this movie is super arty, super weird and surreal. To its benefit, frankly, for me, like it's just super weird, and I really dig on it. Like this one, unlike the other movies we talked about, does revel in some of the gore, but it doesn't have the budget to make the gore look terribly gruesome. But it's the gore combined with the really strange visuals, the weird masks, and some of the other stuff. Like the masks are very unsettling, I think. And some of the other things that you'll see in this movie are just really, really out there. The whole thing with like the goat fellatio stuff, which is not nearly as taboo as it sounds when I say it. But when you see it, it's super weird and uncomfortable that you're gonna feel awkward about it anyways. So that's weird. And then there's the thing that made me the most uncomfortable with this movie, which is not any of the violence, which again, the violence is not that great. It's not there's not a budget for great special effects and makeup and stuff like that. But there's other things in this movie that are so weird and off-putting. It's the blackface. There's a scene in there where a woman in a sex party has put on full on Al Jolson style blackface and is letting somebody whip her like slavery, I guess, while the whole group of people sits and watches and has a good time. Wildly unsettling. Wildly unsettling. It actually drives the conversation about how people want more and more taboo stuff in their pornography. It leads right to that directly to that conversation in the movie. And it's wild. It's so uncomfortable and so awkward. And it's just like really going for it. This movie's going in weird places. And it makes sense because the inspiration for this movie is like the Manson family, which would only have been a few years earlier, not even a full decade earlier when this movie's getting made. And you can definitely see that vibe. Like the people following the lead guy, the ex-con making the snuff film, very much feel like Manson girls, and they look like them, they act like them. I think one of them's even named Patricia. Like, it really is leaning hard into Manson vibes again, to its benefit. It really this movie. I don't want to oversell it. It's not a great movie. It's actually pretty poorly made. It's not, it's not wonderful, but the poor filmmaking works because of how surreal and strange it is. There's so many strange things going on in this movie that just make it feel like a must see like drug trip because the dude was on drugs making it. Like it really winds up being art like too arty almost. Like I feel like a lot of people are gonna hate it, and I can understand that, but I love it. I just think it's super weird, and just like not like anything else I've ever seen. And it is about a snuff film ring, like somebody trying to start a snuff film ring, but it doesn't have that exploration into the psychological impact of that the other movies we talked about had. So it feels a little bit unique in that sense, but it's definitely one that people haven't seen a lot of, and it doesn't really have as big of a reputation as some of the other movies we talked about. But I would say check it out if you like this kind of movie. Again, it's not going to be for everybody, for sure, but it's a trip, and you just kind of have to see it for yourself to understand what I'm talking about because it is out there. Hopefully, I'm not overselling it too much for you guys, but if you have the constitution for it, check this one out because it'll kind of blow your mind. So that's going to do it for our exploration into movies exploring snuff films, not actual exploration into snuff films. But I had a really good time with these movies. It's a weird thing to say that I had a good time with these movies given the subject matter, but these movies are good. They're good movies, and I like that a lot of them are really focusing on like the thriller aspect of it and the psychological aspect of it because I find that stuff to be very interesting, very fascinating. And in our true crime laden society, the fascination we have with true crime really dovetails nicely with the themes in these movies. So I think that really adds an extra layer to it that people can really get behind. So if you haven't seen these movies but you like true crime type stuff, these are movies to check out for sure. And now it's time to check out a horror trivia pursuit card because it's that time where I'm going to answer a question live on camera, hopefully answer it correctly and not embarrass myself. So, given that we're talking about snuff films, let's look at the killer category on the card. And the question is this: 1981's The Burning is the film debut of what Academy Award winning actress? I know this one. We've talked about The Burning on the channel, and I'm pretty sure we talked about this actress being in the movie when we talked about it on the channel because it is one of the noteworthy things about it. And a side note, Jason Alexander is also in the movie. Jason Alexander from Seinfeld, also in the movie in an early role. That's not who they're asking about because they're asking about an actress and Academy Award winner. Again, I know who the answer to this. I'm giving you guys a little bit of time to think about it, but yeah, The Burning in and of itself is a good slasher movie that surprisingly didn't franchise out. You know, you leveraging the legend of Cropsey, which we just talked about recently in our documentary horror subgenre. It's a really fascinating story or legend and a really fun movie with some good special effects, an underrated horror classic. I'll use the word classic boldly there, but it does also have a side reputation for being like early work of a couple of really noteworthy actors, one of them being this actress. And so they're asking about that. I'm kind of dawdling here because I know the answer and I'm pretty confident in the answer. But time for you to lock it in. I think I've prattled on long enough. Either you know this or you don't, right? Like if you've seen the movie, maybe you remember, but either it's like a factoid. It's like one of those trivia question type things that you just know, right? You either know it or you don't. So lock in your answer, whatever it might be. I've got mine ready to go. So my answer is Holly Hunter. Holly Hunter is the Academy Award winning actor that debuted in The Burning, and Holly Hunter is the answer on the card. So yeah, that one it's easy for me because I literally made a video talking about this, so I knew the answer to this one. But did you know the answer to this one? Have you seen The Burning? If you haven't seen The Burning, highly recommend you check it out. If you like slasher films in particular, and you know I do, check out The Burning. It's definitely an underrated slasher that deserved a franchise, frankly, in my opinion. So check that one out. Check out these movies if you like these this kind of stuff, this exploration of the snuff industry, if you will. Thrillers. You have a taste for Hitchcock. A lot of these movies are going to scratch that itch. So these are movies to check out. Definitely stuff that's not as gruesome for the most part. Man Bite Dog being maybe the section, maybe Last House on Dead Street, but most of these pretty accessible, all things considered. So let me know if you do check these out and let me know what you think of them. And until next week, we will talk about something completely different. But for now, we'll just say class dismissed.